So wait, let's pause the audio at least. What are we doing?
What are we doing?
This just to answer some common questions and maybe I don't know what to say.
I got you. Hello and welcome back to Monetize Me. My name is Mac.
My name's Jay.
Today we decided to do more of a FAQ, frequently asked questions about equity and the general topic of equity. And we're coming at it from a perspective of a complete beginner who doesn't know anything about the topic. So I will kind of be asking the questions. I generally know less about equity than Jay. So we will come at it from that perspective and try to answer as many questions as possible, and then do specific episodes on different topics that we kind of cover or touch on in this episode.
So some questions aren't going to have a very quick answer, and we will try to go over it briefly now, but some of them will require a more in-depth video to explain the full concept, and those are things that we're going to hold off on the full answer till down the line.
Yeah. So I guess the first question that always starts the conversation is, what is equity? If you can give like a really brief one sentence.
Yeah, equity is just a shareholder's ownership of a company. So you have company and you have shareholders that together own the company, and equity is how much of that company you own.
Yeah, and so who can be like a shareholder, for example?
A shareholder can range anywhere from an investor investing in a company to the founders to even employees that are working at that company.
Can like regular people be shareholders in the company?
Regular people usually aren't shareholders in a company until it goes public. The only other case would be maybe if you're crowdfunding at the beginning, or you're going to family and friends to try and get like a seed round investment before you get started. Yes.
And like, how much equity would you give out to like friends and family in the beginning? I think this is something that a lot of startups kind of face.
So when you're dealing with friends and family, it should be no different than any other investor, and it's going to be tallied the exact same way. You have to figure out how much your company is valued at, or how much you value your company. Because in the beginning, you don't have any revenue and you don't have any real value, and you haven't been valuated, so you have no valuation to go off of. So what you have to do here is sit down with your founders, go over your business plan and the need you're solving, and try and figure out what it's worth, so that then you can gauge how much equity you should be giving away per dollar.
So would you say that it directly correlates to how the investment relates to the output of the company or what the company is doing?
I think it has to do, like you're talking in terms of what the equity is related to.
Like what the investment, so do we put a, like how do you determine that value is what I'm trying to say. Like what metrics can you use to determine the value of that investment? So if somebody's giving me $100,000, what part of my company, how much of my company should I give them?
Yeah, so that is the question. And you have to look at, well, if all goes well and the company does succeed, at least from your eyes what success is, how much money are you going to be making? How much revenue is there potentially going to be later on? As well as what kind of assets are you maybe acquiring in the process, whether that is IP or maybe just other types of assets, whether that's technology or something else. That valuation or everything you're accruing through the process is what makes up your value as a company.
Okay. So what is like an equity split? If you can just give an overview of what that means.
So an equity split, I'm assuming you're talking about the initial founders, would be how the founders of a company are going to divvy up the equity between themselves.
And what metrics would you use to do an equity split? And what's better? Is an uneven equity split better, or a just straight equal equity split?
Yeah, so based on my research, they actually discourage even equity splits because it comes off as not being thought out. And what investors really want to see when they're investing in a company is a thought out equity split. So if they see, oh, we're 3 founders, so we just split it, we each get a third. Okay, well, you guys clearly haven't thought out what each person is doing because it probably isn't even. So the best thing to do is to have that discussion and figure out, okay, what roles are each of you filling and how much is that role contributing to the company in terms of value? in addition to how much capital is each person giving. Maybe one person is bootstrapping the company with $10,000 out of their own pocket, and the other founders don't have to put in anything. But maybe they're also not really as dedicated or aren't taking as major of a role. So maybe you have to keep that in mind. And from an investor's perspective, he should have this much equity for that $10,000. But from a value of being a founder and the work that they're going to be doing, it's less valuable to the company. So he gets this much for that portion of his role.
So would you say that current roles in a startup play more of an important factor into how equity should split, or should future roles or potential roles play?
I think it is if the company becomes successful and the ideal situation happens where this all works out, it should be how much weight is going to be on each person throughout that process. So from conceiving the idea to your potential exit that you should have thought about before you get into it, how are these roles going to fluctuate? Obviously, it's not always going to be completely even, and it's not always going to stay the same where, oh, well, the tech founder has a lot more weight at the beginning, but maybe the business founder has a lot more weight at the end. You can kind of gauge what that's going to look like and divvy up equity based on that. And so you shouldn't be necessarily too worried about the weight right now and how much responsibility an individual has at the beginning, but how much responsibility they're going to be taking up throughout the entire life of the business.
Would you recommend some form of dynamic equity where you get a certain equity right now in the beginning, and as your role changes or evolves, your equity changes?
No. I don't think dynamic equity is really a thing. You have vesting, which ensures that the founders can't get equity if they leave the company. So vesting is this concept of as long as you're with the company for a long period of time, usually around 4 or 5 years, you can get all your equity, and it vests. The longer you're here, the more of your equity you get. So if I'm a founder that gets 70% of the company over those 4 years, every year I'm accruing more and more equity, usually at like a 1-year cliff. So if I leave before a year, I don't get anything. But I don't think dynamic equity should really be a thing where, I'm assuming you mean I have 50%, but as my role kind of becomes less valuable later on, I get less than 50%, even though I contributed more early on. I don't think that makes too much sense. That's something you should have thought of at the beginning.
Yeah. That's another question is, when should you decide the equity split? When should you decide what equity each person has? Should you decide it at the very beginning of the company? Should you decide it a couple of months in, once everybody's roles are a little set in?
I think you should decide it at the beginning, because if you let the roles set in, then you might be too late. Where it's just like, well, the ball's already rolling, and you've already, if you haven't had this discussion yet, maybe it's not completely solidified, but you should have already had the discussion. Because if you're waiting for the roles to get set in later down the line, that means you didn't think it through. You should have known what roles they were going to play. So I don't think you necessarily need to wait. You should always have a founder's agreement early in the process, even if it's just a rough draft and something that's just easy to write up and on paper and signed in a contract, to make sure that everybody feels like they're being fairly compensated. Because the problem with waiting is then eventually there's going to be some disagreement, and the longer you wait, the bigger that disagreement is going to hurt the company.
Another question that comes to mind is, in a startup, usually the roles are bleeding into each other, and a lot of the time the whole team plays almost the same role. How do you determine the equity split in that case?
I think that scenario usually happens with more novice entrepreneurs, meaning like they're just starting out, or it usually happens when you're going into business with friends. Usually your friends are very similar to you, and you can have the same skill set, so there's a lot of overlap. But ideally, in the case with most successful companies, there's less overlap. Or if there is overlap, you designate one person for that role, because you don't want two people to be working on the same thing taking up different amounts of equity. If you guys are accomplishing the same roles and responsibilities, you guys are the same founder. So you should be taking up the equity of one founder, not two. So the equity split becomes more clear when you decide which roles you are taking on, not oh, well, we're both working on all of these things, then you're just one founder.
So when you say one founder, do you mean that the equity is equally split between both people?
I mean, you should probably find a different founder that fills a gap that you have that the other founder that's too similar to you isn't filling. I think you should just, overall, as a rule of thumb, avoid having that much overlap to where it's going to be a problem. A little bit of overlap is fine, but I'm assuming that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about heavy overlap of a lot of the things we're doing are in the same vertical.
So what if everybody on your team is working on the same vertical, same role? How would you split up the equity then? Would you say that this role gets 20% of the equity, and then we'll wait on other founders to fill in the other roles? And
Are you talking about like the three of us are splitting 20% of the equity?
Something like so. What you're trying to say is that if you play the same role, you should probably take up the equity of one person.
Yeah. Meaning,
so how would you
you
do
shouldn't
that split?
Meaning you shouldn't split it. You should find the one person that's good at that and is going to take that role and have them fill it. And then the other founders either need to fill up different roles or you need to find new founders. Because a business isn't going to be successful if you have three founders that are identical and only good at programming, all programming. You're neglecting the rest of the business. Maybe you guys should found your own companies because that's not a good team.
So the advice would be
to split up.
To split
or
up.
maybe one of them is super dedicated, the others aren't as dedicated, and maybe he should be a solo founder and he can contract them or bring them on as first employees, give them equity or compensation based on that, but the business would then be his and they would just be working for the company.
So what if you have a startup that's heavily reliant on development, especially in the beginning, since they're generating an MVP, and there's really no other tasks going around? Do you just delay the equity split until you get more activities in the other?
Well, the equity split between who? Like who are the founders in this scenario?
Let's say there's 3 dev founders or 4 dev founders.
If there's 3 or 4 dev founders, then if you're all working on a project together, are you going to be able to assume different roles later on? So maybe it's all dev work at the beginning because we haven't gotten to the point where we need sales or marketing or branding. Then maybe that's okay, but you have to figure out early on, okay, well, after we get past this stage of being a startup and we get on to needing those other roles, who's going to fill those? Because eventually they're going to need to be filled. We have to keep in mind that some of us may need to leave this main role and go assume the other roles. I think that would be okay. But again, it might be better to find a founder down the line to fill that role or to hold off and just have some of them be employees or contractors, not necessarily 4 founders doing the exact same thing. Not that it can't work, but it's complicated. Yeah.
Is there a mechanism for a company to safeguard equity for future use, and keep it separate from founders' equity, employees' equity?
The way I look at it is the founders' equity gets diluted as you give out equity to other investors or employees or whatever. So if you have 3 founders that are splitting it evenly just for simplicity's sake, and then down the line you get employees, and you're like, well, I need to take 10% and give them out to employees. Well, once you section that off, those founders are now down to 90% that they're splitting. And then, oh, well, we need an investor, we're giving him 10%. Okay, well, the founders are down to 80. It's not that you necessarily need to be like, oh, well, this is set aside for them. You should keep that in mind, be ready to give out that equity and mentally prepare for the founders' shares getting shorter and shorter or smaller and smaller. But I think it's not necessarily you have to specifically section it off. Just have it ready for employees or investors.
Yeah. So in that sense, founders' equity is kind of dynamic. Or you could say that the founders get a percentage.
Founders' equity is dynamic in a sense that the founders' equity is what gets diluted over time as they give out more equity. But the founders' equity is not dynamic in terms of like, well, one founder started with 50% of the founder's total equity and the other started with 50. And then later on it went to, well, 80-20 and then, well, 70-30. And it's just going back and forth. It's dynamic compared to the rest of the company where, oh, well, I'm giving away 10% to an investor now in exchange for capital. And so now all the founders are now splitting less equity, but it didn't change the amount that each founder gets.
So my question is this what is done in all companies, or is this one model?
It's just one model. There's a lot of companies do it a lot of different ways. So there's plenty of research and plenty of variation on this, but it's just a very vague kind of overview of what equity splits look like.
Because from what I remember, there's a lot of founders for like these big companies that actually have shares that don't really change much if the company is giving away equity to somebody else. Like they own this part of the
It
company.
might maybe at that point, but probably not when they were founders. It might be now, like at this point in time, they changed their shares to be okay. I am now a founder CEO, but like I am. We have investors, or you go public, and yeah, especially after the public, your shares are now your shares. So in order to get diluted, you would have to like create more shares and get outside investment, and that would dilute all of the shares, not just the founders.
How do you create shares?
That's a complicated process that I haven't done enough research into to answer, but I think it's less of something that you worry about, and you worry more about, well, when do I need to create more shares, and that would be when you're looking to sell those shares to get more capital.
So as a startup, you're mainly worried about the percentages of who owns what percentage of the company.
In terms of a startup being just the founders at the beginning before any seed round or any investment, the only equity split you're concerned about is the equity of the company, ownership of the company distributed amongst the founders, not necessarily taking into account investors. You have to keep in mind that eventually investors will take equity, and you'll be selling equity to investors and putting it towards employees and all that. But as far as splitting it up amongst the founders, just take 100% of the equity that's left over, and that's what you guys are going to be splitting.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I think equity is very complicated.
Equity is very complicated.
And we could kind of sit here all night
Going
back and forth. And
I think
asking
I do like
questions
the
about
Q&A
equity.
style though, so I think we should definitely continue this. I think there's a lot more questions, even specifically about equity, that might be helpful later on, and maybe we can go on a different tangent and answer different questions there. But I think this is hitting the end of our time limit for this video.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much for watching.
Yeah.
If you have any other questions that you want to recommend,
or if any of my answers were wrong,
oh yeah, that too.
you can call me out on that too.
But thank you so much. Let us know what you think about the new format.
Yeah, well, it's not the new format. It's a new format that we're trying out because we thought it'd be helpful for this specific scenario.
Yeah.
Right.
Have a good night.
YouTube.
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 Oh.